Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discern This, a podcast that brings you insight into global affairs. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. At the time that we're recording this, the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza is grinding into its third month. The toll of dead and wounded continues to rise. The humanitarian nightmare in Gaza worsens, and Hamas continues to hold more than 100 people hostage as bargaining chips. Despite international calls for a ceasefire and humanitarian pauses, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vows no international pressure will force an end to this conflict. The war has been largely confined to Gaza and the occupied West Bank, but repercussions continue to spread across not only the Middle East, but right around the globe. Joining us now for some perspective on that is Professor Stephen Walt, the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Relations at Harvard University. Hello, and thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you again, Jim.
Well, let's dive right into it. While some may see the war in Gaza as just another round of the same old Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been going on for decades, you have looked at this crisis and said the world isn't going to be the same when the dust settles. Why?
I think this is going to have long and far-reaching implications for lots of other conflicts. And one way to think about it is to just think of where we were on October 6th, before Hamas attacked Israel. The United States was engaged in a war, backing up Ukraine and attempting to achieve some kind of reasonable solution there. Lots of attention, lots of resources going in that direction. The United States was also trying to focus much more heavily on China and shift a lot of American attention, waging something of an economic war against China as well. And they were trying to finally pull off a sort of complicated normalization arrangement between Saudi Arabia and Israel as part of keeping Saudi Arabia basically on our side while they were flirting to a greater extent with China. So those were the big items on the Biden administration's agenda. And the attack and subsequent war against Gaza has, I think, derailed almost all of those things. It put a monkey wrench in the normalization process, may have ended it forever, we'll have to see. It certainly has made it much more difficult to shift lots of attention to Asia, right? There's just a bandwidth problem here where the Biden administration is focused overwhelmingly now. Biden has been to the Middle East. Anthony Blinken has been to the Middle East several times. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has just been to the Middle East. This means you've got less time and attention to focus on China as well. And finally, we could go on, but I'll just say it's a disaster for Ukraine, because suddenly Ukraine's not on the front pages the way it once was, and some military resources, such as artillery shells, that might have gone to Ukraine have now been diverted over to Israel and used to help Israel prosecute its war in Gaza. You put all this together, and then you consider how this plays out in the global South. I think this is really a disaster for American foreign policy.
For decades, the U.S. has positioned itself as that, indispensable mediator in all things Palestinian-Israeli. And frankly, when you look at it, you see the situation today, you say, wow, that hasn't worked at all.
No. And no, I think that if historians 50 years from now will look back on American stewardship of the peace process and broader attempts to manage and in some cases remake the Middle East as a tragic disaster that didn't really help anyone at all. And it's not just our failure to bring about a two-state solution, something that Bill Clinton tried to pull off, George Bush was in favor of, Barack Obama worked very hard on. Our failure to deliver that, of course, is one of the reasons why we have a political conflict that led to the terrorist attacks on October 7th. But it's not just that. It's also the effects of American policy in Iraq, the effects of American policy in Libya, the fact that Lebanon is now a basket case here. You can point to a whole series of things. And what Americans should recognize is that this actually plays into the narratives that countries like China try to present about America's role in the world and how we need a different kind of global order. For the Russians and for the Chinese, this is manna from heaven. They can say, look what happened happens when the United States tries to manage a region by itself. You get nothing but disasters. Maybe we need a world in which power is shared more, where the American role is diminished and other countries have greater influence. You can disagree with that, but it's a pretty compelling argument, and lots of people around the world are going to nod their heads in agreement when they hear it.
Well, Iran has always played a role in the Middle East, or it seems so. And a lot of people see the fine hand of Iran behind the troubles that we are seeing in Gaza today, and certainly October the 7th. But as the U.S. tried to handle all of this, and this goes back decades, it seems that Iran was left out of the equation.
Yeah, Iran has been marginalized for a long time, and for me, the real taproot moment is the Madrid conference in 1992, in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. Remember, this was a stunning victory for the United States. It's really the high watermark, almost, of American prestige and status. We'd organized this large coalition, defeated Saddam Hussein's army decisively. We had done so, by the way, with tacit support from Russia and China. So this is really a moment. And the Bush administration is able to successfully put together a big peace conference, which isn't going to achieve a final settlement to all these issues, but at least is setting the architecture in place to try and construct finally a more peaceful Middle Eastern order. But the one thing they also did was they excluded Iran from this. Here you have a major Middle Eastern country, and it was decided for a variety of reasons that they wouldn't be invited. Well, the Iranian response was predictable. They said, all right, if you're going to try to organize this region without listening to our concerns, without allowing us a seat at the table, we're going to do whatever we can to derail that effort. There had been almost no relationship between Hamas and Iran prior to 1992, but in the immediate aftermath of Madrid, Iran began backing some of these Palestinian extremist groups, not because it was so strongly committed to the Palestinian cause, but because this was a way of complicating the American effort to impose its own more unilateral vision. And I think one of the reasons you end up where we are today is you can't create a stable regional order there by excluding any of the key players.
And they are a key player. As we look at it, the key player is also on the Israeli side. Today, they're out and out saying, forget the two-state solution. It's off the table. Now, they're far from the only ones. But there's some people that see in this an opportunity to just bury this peace process, this idea of a two-state solution, bury it forever and move on. Will they succeed?
I think that remains to be seen. I mean, there's no question that this is a sort of classic phenomenon we see in lots of other circumstances where the extremists on both sides actually support each other. Not deliberately, but in effect. So you have the extreme right in Israel, which has been growing increasingly influential over time, ever since the 1990s, now strongly opposed to a two-state solution. The Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom in an interview this past week said, absolutely not. We're not going that way at all. And of course,
using October the 7th as a justification, even though that was her position before.
Exactly. And of course, we have, the more extreme settler movements who see this as an opportunity to continue ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. Some Israeli politicians talking about trying to drive Gazans out of Gaza completely as well. A second Nakba, to refer back to the original expulsion of Palestinians in the 1948 war. So you have extremists there, but of course that merely fuels the extremists like Hamas on the other side as well. So in a sense, the actions of the two most extreme ends here strengthen the political position of the other and make any kind of reasonable political settlement even more elusive.
Well, the Biden administration they stood up at the United Nations and slapped a veto on a call for a ceasefire, and they flat out said that, Israel needs more time in order to complete the job. And a lot of people see that as almost the same thing that happened when Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State, and she gave Israel more time to bomb Lebanon into ashes. And they just don't see that as a solution or a helpful policy at all. The United States isn't leading. It's really following the dictate of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, I think this is an old story, unfortunately. I mean, the principal reason why American stewardship of the peace process over many years failed was the U.S. leaders were unable to put pressure on both sides. In order to get a genuine two-state solution, you were going to have to push the Palestinians to make various compromises, but you were also going to have to push Israel very hard. And you could only do that if you were willing to make American support for Israel conditional on going along with this. And of course, that's something that Clinton could not do. That's something Bush could not do. Condi Rice couldn't do it, and neither could Barack Obama. And they couldn't do it primarily because there are very well-organized political groups here in the United States who oppose making American support for Israel conditional at all. So now you have the rather remarkable situation where Israel is waging unconstrained war against the population of Gaza, killing civilians at a disproportionate number, and in fact saying that they're not really trying to be very discriminating about this. Some Israeli politicians, likening them to animals, dehumanizing them in a variety of ways. And they're doing this with the full and active support of the U.S. government, with, additional military aid being sent in the middle of this, and no possibility of any kind of political process that might actually not actually fix this. And the fact that the United States once again finds itself vetoing a ceasefire resolution in the UN Security Council, a ceasefire resolution that every other Security Council member supported except the United Kingdom, which abstained, I think plays very badly in public opinion, particularly at the same moment that the United States is trying to rally the rest of the world to support our position against, the Russian incursion in Ukraine. So you put those two things together, and the United States looks deeply hypocritical.
So what can the Biden administration do? I almost feel sorry for Joe Biden because I don't see what options are there.
Well, the Biden administration is, I think, definitely constrained by this. I don't feel all that sorry because I think Joe Biden is also doing what he believes in. He has, I think, a quite outmoded view of Israel's security situation. He said a couple of rather absurd things last week about, if Israel didn't exist, Jews in the United States would not be safe, which I think is just simply empirically wrong and was widely condemned by American Jews, I might add, for a variety of reasons. So I think he's reflecting, sincere beliefs and kind of old think as well. But in a sense, he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. If he were to really put pressure on the Netanyahu government, this would cost him support from some parts of the American Jewish community. This would certainly invite fervent criticism from AIPAC and other groups as well. Of course, if he doesn't do that, he risks losing support from some progressives in the United States who are concerned by this, and certainly from some parts of the Arab American population, which could play a role in some critical battleground states like Michigan. And also just the general sense that the United States is not standing up for its real principles here in allowing this carnage to continue. So yes, some sympathy in that no matter which way he goes here, he's going to pay a political price.
We talked about, and we'll talk some more about how this has spread, the effects of this war have spread right around the world, but they've also spread on U.S. campuses. You're there at Harvard, and there were calls for the president of your university to step down because she didn't answer a question correctly in front of a subcommittee on Capitol Hill. You have some ideas about just which way universities should go when it comes to these kinds of highly controversial political issues that are going to arise again and again and again.
Yeah. Well, I've long believed that universities as institutions should not be taking positions on controversial political issues, except those that directly affect the functioning of the university itself as a community of scholars and students who are pursuing knowledge. So we shouldn't weigh in on whether abortion should be legal. We shouldn't weigh in on whether or not it's a good idea to invade Iraq. We shouldn't weigh in on any of those things as institutions. So presidents should not be issuing statements of that sort and shouldn't be expected to. Individual scholars and individual students are free to say whatever they want and, by the way, to accept the consequences for the positions that they take, the criticism they might invite if they take an unpopular or controversial position. And it's important for universities and important for academic freedom that that be given as much rein as possible as well. And so, I think universities have violated this principle of institutional neutrality in the past, and to some degree they're paying a price for it now. The difficulty is once you start taking positions on controversial issues, again, as an institution rather than as an individual scholar, then, of course, you're expected to take a position on everything. If you remain silent on any issue, that's going to be taken as implicit endorsement or whatever. So in general, universities need to walk back from this idea that they have to take a stand as an organization and instead try to foster environments where people continue to question, continue to express their views as openly and freely as possible. And in those rare cases where people step over the bounds of speech and say things that are genuinely threatening, etc., then universities have procedures for dealing with that. Because obviously threats to other people interfere with academic freedom and in most cases are also illegal as well. And we have ways of dealing with that in our legal system and in university procedures.
Well, maybe you can share with us, a little bit of insight, Professor Walt. I mean, what have professors been telling students that suddenly they arise and Israel is attacked, a horrific attack that really defines terrorism and war crimes by Hamas in southern Israel, and yet all these students turn out on campus and they're defying conventional wisdom, they're defying the logic that they've supposedly heard that's been pounded into them and saying, no, it's the Palestinians that are the victims here.
Well, certainly Palestinians are victims, which is not to say that Israelis were not victims at various points in the past, and certainly on October 7th. So, some of the controversy at Harvard arose from a statement by a number of student groups within a day or so of the initial attacks, which I think was a dumb statement, factually incorrect for a variety of reasons, and remarkably insensitive. And I think that's what provoked some of it. But again, their statements like that are governed by academic freedom. I don't believe the president of the university should have taken a position condemning it or otherwise. Should have distanced the university as an institution from that. And the students, by the way, once they issued that statement, were open to criticism and should have been criticized. I and others have condemned what they said as being wrong and hurtful and all of that, but that's what academic freedom is all about. People are going to take controversial positions as well. I believe that now there's a story or a myth that's emerged that college campuses are hotbeds of anti-Semitism, and I think that's largely wrong. In fact, almost entirely wrong. There will have been individual incidents that are disturbing, but the idea that these are arenas where hatred against Jews is being encouraged or even tolerated, I think does not bear up to much scrutiny if you look carefully at it.
As you look at this, and you're the realist here, and that's why I always like listening to what you have to say. Realistically, does the U.S. have to admit now that it doesn't have all the answers? It needs input from other sources. It needs others to be involved. It can't go it alone. And as some have said, act as Israel's attorney in all of this. What is the way forward?
Well, getting American foreign policy officials to admit that they're not indispensable and they don't have all the answers is a real uphill fight. But certainly with respect to Middle East policy, I think this is an area where maybe a little more broader listening and letting others have more of a role, might be helpful as well. Certainly, our track record in handling Middle East conflicts, and particularly this conflict, doesn't give us much confidence. I think the broader issue, though, and this I think is going to hurt the Biden administration in other ways and hurts the United States more generally, is it doesn't make us look particularly competent. We often hear people talking about American credibility and the importance of other countries trusting us. Part of what gives us credibility and part of what generates trust is the sense that American officials really do know what's going on. They have their fingers on the pulse, they understand the problems, and they've got good ideas for how to solve them. This incident now happening in the Middle East, or this tragedy unfolding in the Middle East, doesn't make American leaders look particularly competent. We didn't see it coming. We were as surprised as everyone. Jake Sullivan famously published an article a week before saying the Middle East had never been as quiet as it was now, etc. And that doesn't make us look like we're on top of things. We seem largely ineffectual. We're in trying to get Israel to restrain itself in Gaza. We're not trying very hard, and that doesn't make us look particularly competent as well. And I think over time, this is the kind of thing that eats away at our influence in lots of other arenas. If other countries, if other officials begin to say, the Americans either don't get it or they're incapable for political reasons at home of doing the right thing, then we're going to have to listen to others. We're going to have to look elsewhere. And, for those of you who might be worried about China, the Chinese can come in and say, look, we get along with everyone. We have diplomatic relations with every country in the region. We trade and invest with every country in the region. We have no dog in these particular fights. All we really care about is energy from the Middle East as well. Maybe we'd be a better honest broker. We did a pretty good job mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier this year. Maybe a world in which we, the Chinese, have more influence on some of these problems would be a better world than one where the United States monopolizes its position and then screws things up. I worry that argument is going to play to a very sympathetic audience in many parts of the world.
Professor Stephen Walt, thank you very much for joining us. Some great ideas for us all to think about. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure talking with you, Jim.
And thank you for joining us on Discern This, a podcast that tries to fill in some of the gaps in understanding global issues. If you enjoyed this, follow us on YouTube and subscribe. Also, take a moment to listen to what some of our other guests have had to say in other episodes. That's this edition. I'm Jim Clancy. Thanks for spending a part of your day with us.